Hello and welcome back to the channel to another of my interviews. Thank you very much for joining me. Today, I thought I was the well-dressed man on the internet, but apparently I've got competition with my guest today. I'm talking to Geoff, who is a salesman and has had a lot of experience with hospital trusts, governments, selling supplies. And he came forward and he wanted to talk to me about the ineptitude and possibly the corruption that is going on in some of these very large public bodies that we pay for. Geoff, welcome to the show. It's lovely to have you on board. And first of all, may I say, you do look like a Time Lord from an early Doctor Who episode. Very nice. Nice to see you. We could be a double act.
Indeed. Well, I've been watching this character on YouTube for a few months now, and I can't think of his name, but he looks a lot like you, and he dresses a lot like you. And I thought, well, out of respect, I don't want to be outdone too much, so I'd make a bit of an effort. And I've got the waistcoat on here as well.
It's very smart, I have to say.
And the jacket. Don't get to wear them too often, so yeah.
So that begs the question: are you normally just in jeans and a t-shirt then? A Hawaiian skirt, maybe.
Well, I've got a skirt on. I'd rather not show you that, though.
No, fair enough. I don't think the viewers will be too keen on that.
No.
Brilliant. So you said to me before we started recording, you're in sales and you've dealt with these departments that that we fund, basically, like hospital trust, the government and things. And we assume that the people behind these things, maybe we don't assume it so much these days after the pandemic that we've had and the various backhanders and things that have gone. But we've always assumed that the reason that these trusts have big buying power is that they can buy efficiently, effectively, and if it's our money, taxpayers' money, they can get us the best deals. But I have a feeling that you're going to tell me that's not the case.
Well, yeah, there's so much that I could tell, and just one slight correction though. I'm retired now.
Right. Okay. So tell us a little bit about your background, then. You know, be as specific or non-specific as you like, just so the audience get a feel for who you are and what you're about to tell us.
Okay. Well, in my early days, I worked in the fashion industry as a salesman and worked the whole of the north of England. Working for a variety of different companies, calling on anything from department stores, retail shops, and market stalls, selling fashion clothing.
Right.
And then I got to a point where I didn't think it was going to continue at the same level, and I looked elsewhere, and I went to work for a company who supplied goods loosely within the building trade as such. So it was there that I started to discover that the world was very, very different to the sort of private small enterprise, even up to the large enterprises that I dealt with in the fashion business. But supplying goods and services to, as you rightly said, many, many different types of businesses, which included a number of government departments and hospital trusts. Really opened my eyes to the wasteful and shameful amounts of money that were just willfully thrown away. I mean, we see this at sort of national level, national leaders who basically have no regard for us whatsoever. That's perfectly clear. But it's become almost impossible to expose them and actually to take it to where there's some action taken against them. So why not try, rather than doing it top down, why not try it from the bottom up? And I think it would be a great idea for somebody maybe to start a channel where whistleblowers could go on, perhaps anonymously for obvious reasons, unless you've got people who are retired and able to bring out information. I doubt whether there's been much change in the period since I retired from work, but yeah, it's certainly something that we should be looking at as funds are being wasted right, left, and centre. And the thing I'd probably start with is that we've heard many times that departments will be allocated a set amount of money for the year, for the business year, and if they get to the end of that year and funds are still available, then if they don't use up all of that fund, then the money is not allocated the following year. Government has said, of course, that no, we don't do that anymore, but I know for a fact that it still does happen.
Mm.
And one particular story that I could start with, it was there was a trust that I was dealing with, and it was like a holding centre for people who couldn't really look after themselves, people who perhaps had certain mental issues, if we're allowed to say that nowadays.
Yeah, I think so.
And so these people could be harmful to themselves and to others, and so therefore they were held in this. It wasn't a prison, it wasn't a hospital, it was somewhere in between, I guess you'd say.
Mm.
And so money was left over. So one year they decided that they would treat the boys and perhaps buy them some mountain bikes. So 5 mountain bikes were purchased. This is about 10 years ago, or slightly longer perhaps. And they were £1,500 each, so £7,500. Not a huge sum of money, but when one of the directors of the trust came through and saw the boxes, he asked what they were, was duly told they were exercise bikes. And he announced, well, what if somebody escapes on one of the bikes and commits a crime? How silly are we going to look? So they were canned, they were left in the boxes, they were kind of not spoken of again. And up to the point that I left that business, apparently those bikes were still in their boxes and not used. That's just a small point, but within the same trust, another year they had money left over and they bought new computers. A year later, they had money left over again, and the flat screen computers had come out. So it was somebody's bright idea that they should change all the computers again. So another party said, well, isn't that a bit foolish because we only changed all our computers last year and we still have some in boxes unopened. Anyway, the decision was made to buy the new flat screens, and everybody was told to unplug their old computers, etc., and take them outside and throw them in the skip. So people didn't throw them in the skip; they placed them in there very delicately.
Yes.
And when they were leaving, as the skips were in the car park and they were going to their cars, they were then taking the computers out and taking them home, 1, 2, 3, whatever they wanted for their families, etc. Of course, somebody spotted what was going on, told the directors of the trust what had happened. Those people who had taken the computer units were held to account the following morning, and they were told that it was theft. They just thought because they were in the skips, it wasn't theft, and quite innocently had taken them away. So the director said to them, well, look, what we'll do is we'll have to sell them to you, because then obviously we wipe off any threats of theft and so on. So he said to them, yep, you can buy them. How about $3.99? And one of the guys said, well, that sounds a bit expensive, because they're only $5.99 in Currys. So the director
sorry,
said,
I thought you meant literally £3.99 as
that's what
a
he
figure.
meant.
Oh, he did mean that.
Yes. So they bought them for £3.99, whereas 12 months earlier, they would have got them direct from one of the suppliers, so they wouldn't have paid Curry's price, but it wouldn't have been a great deal less. But they bought them for £3.99, which is just laughable. And everybody laughed about it. Unfortunately, it hadn't rained that night, so anybody that hadn't helped themselves to a computer went and got one for £3.99.
I know from a chap who I once met who delivered skips for a living that actually it is illegal to take anything out of a skip whilst the skip is still on their premises. But the minute, even if it's on their premises, it's lifted up in the air, apparently, it's no longer theft, because it's no longer on the ground. This is one of those useless facts that somebody told me.
So bear that in mind, everybody.
Yeah, so, I mean, if you see a floating skip, of course. So the point where it's going from one position on the ground onto the skip, you can grab stuff, and it's not technically anybody's, as far as I'm aware.
Slightly more dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, it's a strange old situation, isn't it? Because I suppose the people making the decisions are just, they know that's their budget, and if they have that theory that the money is going to run out for next year, they better spend it up, and they're looking at different and inventive ways. It does seem silly not to, if it's public money, to try and get as much money back as they can, because I mean, those, even if they were going to give them away, they could at least give them away to charity organizations and
Sure.
places like that.
Yeah.
Or maybe, not knowing how powerful those computers were. I mean, I know a lot of corporate computers are a bit, they don't have a lot in them really, because they operate off a central database, don't they? So they're more like a terminal thing. So sometimes they're not as good, but the screens and the mice and the things are all useful things.
But another sort of great story was I had a friend who worked for the DSS. This goes back a little bit further, and every January to April, he would always work weekends. And he was quite a close friend of mine at the time. And so I said to him, "How come you only do overtime from January to April?" He said, "Well, we have to use up the overtime money that
Right.
we don't need. Nobody ever does overtime because it wasn't necessary. But come January, we'll find that there's X amount of money in the pot. And again, we've got to use it or it gets taken away from us for the next year." So I said, "Well, if you don't need it ever, how come it keeps reoccurring?"
Yeah.
He wasn't concerned because he was earning very, very good money. He was getting double time for Saturdays and Sundays. And I said to him one day, "What did you do this week?" Because I had nothing to do. I said, "Were you counting pencils and sharpening them?" And he said, "How did you realize?"
Yeah.
And I
So
said, "So you were literally doing that and counting paper and doing a stock take, which was unnecessary."
yeah.
And again, it was thousands and thousands of pounds with people just sitting around an office all day Saturday and on Sunday, just wasting time.
So as
And
long as
then,
they were there,
as
they
long as
could.
they were there, they would get paid. They might as well have just given them the money because they
Mm,
were doing nothing that was effective.
yeah, they
Uh,
would have saved money by not having to turn the lights on.
and heating because it was winter
And
time.
yeah, and heating, exactly. Yeah.
So again, just wasting of money. So I've got a great story now about another trust where I dealt with the stores department, and
Mm,
so effectively, what the stores would do is they would respond to requests from the various wards and the various other buildings that they took charge of, and supplied with anything from pencils, telephones, fridges, etc., etc. Anything, bed sheets, you name it, whatever the wards wanted or the other buildings required that were off site, off the main site,
yeah.
they would ring through to the stores and ask them to deliver them to them or to order them in specially. So I remember dealing with one particular chap. There were three people in this stores department. We'll call them numbers 1, 2, and 3. So number one, I would invariably, when I went in to see him, which was either on a 2 or 4 weekly cycle, he would be sat either with his feet up on the table watching television, or he'd be playing solitaire. And I believe he was very, very good at solitaire because he got a lot of practice. And he would
Yeah.
always moan about how busy they were and how stressful this job was.
Right.
I mean, if you're in a sales job, that can be very stressful because you have a
Yes.
good month, or what you've got to do is do it again and again and again. Anyhow, so this sort of sorrowful guy went to a point where he really was terribly stressed and very fatigued. Goodness knows how, because as I say, it wasn't visible through the amount of work that he did. But I went in one time and he wasn't there. So I spoke to number two, and I said, "What happened to number one?" He said, "Well, he's gone off with stress. He's going to be off for 6 months." I said, "How can you be sure he's off for 6 months?" "Because he said he's going to be off for 6 months." Apparently, at that time, it may have changed. Again, it was a few years ago. They could easily take time off, and they get full pay at that stage. Perhaps that's changed as well now. I hope it has anyway. So he's on his 6 month break, and number two and number three are left in charge. So now two men have to do the job of three, which I'm sure they easily cope with. So as my regular calls went on, number two would again always respond and come to the counter when I went in there, and we do a bit of business and so on. So I said to him, "How are you coping?" He said, "Yeah, coping okay." He said, "But as soon as he comes back, I'm going off for 6 months." And I said, "What for?" He said, "With stress." He said, "If it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me." So the time came and the 6 months was up. Number one came back. However, number one didn't go back into the stores. He went upstairs into a nice cushy number where he openly told me that not only were his hours reduced from 37 hours down to 32, but he was also going to get a £4,000 a year rise, which was about, I think it was 15 to 20% increase and less hours.
Wow.
So now you've got number three in the storeroom on his own. And I said to him, how are you going to cope now you're on your own? He says, be real. It's not a problem. I can easily do this job. I just didn't know how to work the computer, didn't know all the suppliers. He said, but yeah, it's not a problem. And I said, well, I hope they're rewarding you for it. Oh, no, he was on the same money. So now you've got one man doing three men's jobs. How that carried out in the end, I don't know, because I left the company before number two came back, essentially. But again, it was just an example of they were overmanned, underworked,
And
and
you can't help feeling that this is repeated up and down the country in all
indeed,
sorts of departments, that people have made their job seem more important and busier than it is, so that they've. I mean, I'm casting aspersions here or making a broad sweeping statement, but you can't help feeling that people will like a cushy number if they can get it. I would be very surprised if anybody working for themselves could have that kind of luxury, because
absolutely,
when
absolutely.
you work for
Anybody in the
yourself.
corporate world, the number of companies that I've worked for, if you had to have time off with stress, it meant you couldn't do the job. That
Yeah.
was it. And they didn't necessarily offer you any help or guidance. You had to pull yourself together. And if you couldn't do the job, then go elsewhere, or you could take a different role, perhaps, if it was available. But certainly it seems within the sort of realm of government departments that people were very much easily and simply accommodated where they couldn't cope. But I was just one of many, many people doing the same kind of work up and down the country, and I'm sure that my experiences aren't just confined to my my particular area. This sort of thing happened everywhere, and corruption played a huge part as well. We had one particular guy who would place orders, but the goods weren't delivered to the offices where they should have been. He was ordering goods for his own business, and he got away with it. I mean, I daren't go into any more detail there, but this again was something that was happening. I won't say on a massive scale, and it was only people in certain levels of authority who could get away with that.
Yeah.
But it did go on. It was theft.
What's the mindset of these people then? What's the mindset that says, I'm working for the government, this is taxpayers' money I'm dealing with, and not only am I sort of not pulling my weight, but I'm potentially booking things in for my own personal pleasure or for my own business, or I'm buying stuff. What goes through these people's minds? Is it because they've been there so long that they've just seen the weaknesses in the system and they've just been opportunists, or is it much more nefarious than that they deliberately got into these positions so that they can either further themselves or just have a much easier job? Or is it just pot luck?
I think it's, and again, it's just an abuse of power, and it seems something that's inherent in within the government departments. Money was unaccounted for. There were no proper checks and balances. Again, it might have changed, because I've been away from this for a while. And again, I'll repeat myself and say I hope it has. But
yeah, I mean, we continually hear, don't we, that there is always these cost-saving measures that we can keep squeezing certain things. But is it the lower ranks who are completely being squeezed? So the ones that are actually pulling the weight and getting on with jobs. And are the ones who are doing the cost, the person who's got basically time to sit and watch the television and put his feet up and watch another episode of Neighbours or whatever is currently on these days. I don't know. I don't have a television anymore. Is it their level that gets squeezed? I mean, you've just illustrated how three people were doing a job, and in the end it's one, and he can still do it quite happily. Are they getting rid of the middle managers and the upper managers?
Well, again, in a lot of these hospital trusts, and I know from a close friend now who's involved in a trust, he sees what goes on, and they're bringing in, or they have been doing over a number of years, they've been bringing in more levels of management rather than taking them out. And of course, as you bring more people in, they impose their will because they've got to make an impression. And again, it's just wasteful people coming into a position. They're not necessarily abusing it when you bring in a whole new level of management, but the fact that you're paying them fairly large salaries for doing very, very little. Again, now it would be great to have somebody on to counter to what I'm saying now, and I'm
Yes.
sure there are plenty of people that would be capable of doing that. But I know from having been involved with this for several years that a lot of these people know that they're winging it as such and doing very, very, very little and getting reasonably, in fact, in some cases, rather large sums of money for doing next to nothing. But they have to make an impression, they have to impose themselves in some way so as they can be seen to be involved, caring, and doing their jobs. But invariably, it seems that they just make it even worse, more costly, more involved, more difficult to carry out tasks, etc. The guys at the ground level that I perhaps dealt with more so, um, they just happened to find themselves in a situation that they could take advantage of because they knew that
Mm.
because the people who were above them hadn't done their job, so they didn't understand it,
Right.
so that they could do their little tricks and so on and go unchecked.
And this is because things just have got so big. You know, I mean,
Indeed, far
if
too
you've
big.
got far too big, slow organisation, and again another reason to have much smaller government, more smaller departments, fewer people making the decisions, and people just getting on with the task that they're supposed to be doing.
Sure.
And I mean, my experience of the corporate world seemed to be. I mean, I've never really worked in it. I've been self-employed and been freelance within there doing corporate videos in the past. But the amount of meetings that people would have, meetings sometimes 4 meetings.
Indeed.
So we're having a meeting about somebody who's coming in, so we better have a meeting about that. And you never thought, how does anything ever get done?
It doesn't.
Well, exactly. I mean, I know, here am I operate my little YouTube channel, which on the face of it, people may think, oh, you just do a monologue in the morning and then you do an interview in the afternoon and that's it. And they don't see everything else that goes on. And, you know, to be honest with you, I didn't quite know how involved all of this was starting to get. And now I'm rolling out some more bits and pieces for the channel because there's so much going on. And you're just going, when do I get time off? And you think, yeah, you could employ people to do stuff, but you've got to train them up. You've got to then, you know, keep an eye on them. Are they doing the right thing? They've got questions. You're trying to get on. And sometimes it's just quicker to just make quick decisions, get on with it. You make a few mistakes. You learn from those mistakes. But in these big organisations where they seem to just, you know, oh, we need somebody to sharpen the pencils. We better employ somebody then.
Well, that was something else that I saw happen also, where your local councils, when they were local councils, before they were amalgamated and made into bigger areas, they would have their own men to do all of the sort of building work and associated jobs. And then all of a sudden, they were bringing in outside contractors, which would cost infinitely more money. And it took away the control and it took away the quality as well because they went unchecked. And then you had, without going into it now, you had these PFI agreements, which I'm sure you know about, public funded works where private money was brought in and government bodies leased back buildings, etc. That's a whole other area, but that was just massively more costly. But just getting back to something you said about whether the government, because it got so big, they were unable to keep a check of what they were paying, and everything was done on a local scale. But it actually did make sense to bring it all together. So there was a time when Alan Sugar brought in a team of people. I think it was under David Cameron, but I stand to be corrected on that. And he was brought in as the government's business czar.
Oh yes, I do.
And
I remember. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, he was the
they
business
were they were
czar.
paid something like
You're
£300,000
fired.
to determine whether the government was getting value for money and whether it was paying the right amount for goods and services. So, just to give a very simple example, if they were buying A4 paper, a packet of A4 paper, it was found that they were paying, let's say, £2 in London, but they might have been paying £16 in Glasgow and £28 in Liverpool. So, how could they bring that together? And so Alan Sugar and his team were paid £300,000, and I just wish they'd asked me if I could have done it, because I could have done it for half the amount of money, and it would have been just one sentence or perhaps even one word, and the one word answer was no. And it was blindingly obvious. Um, Even within one particular borough council, you might be dealing with 5 different departments and supplying very similar um, goods to each of them. But there were no fixed prices, and nobody necessarily asked you for fixed prices. Often they wouldn't even ask you for a price. Um,
Gosh.
but that wasn't just pertaining to the company that I work for. It was happening nationally. That there was just no care, because it wasn't their money. They were unaccountable. Nobody checked on all of these things. There was an attempt, though, by a consortium of people who thought it was a great idea to come together to put a national buying list, if you like, together, which would have been incredibly difficult, because in many cases, to a lot of companies that supply services to government departments, the government as a collective in the whole of the country are probably their biggest customer
Right.
in many, many cases, be it whether they're buying cars or whatever else. So these group of people came together to try and formulate a system which would have been near impossible. I don't know if they were successful. Again, I left the business before it concluded, but a number of companies were keen to get on board, but a lot of other companies weren't interested, because they were making such vast profits in supplying these government departments. They didn't want to be tied down to a specific price for a particular product, because they would be working on vastly reduced margins.
Hmm.
So
So do you think just bringing it to sort of more modern times at the moment? I know this will be a bit out of your expertise. Well, not out of your expertise, but out of your actual knowledge. But during the COVID pandemic, we've seen from the Twitter files the nonsense that has been going on, the backhanders, and the amount of services that were quickly taken advantage of, and which ministers and their cohorts have managed to make a lot of money for themselves, and putting out tenders to companies that had no, it seems to me, no experience in something, saying, can you make us ventilators, or can you supply PPE? And they, that's not their remit. And somehow on the back of an envelope, some sort of contract was quickly drawn up. I mean, we've seen all this. Presumably, that's happened in big government, and we know that lots of money, complete ineptitude was going on there. But presumably, this is also, if that's big government, a version of that is happening all the time in all the different boroughs.
well, let me give you 2 examples. One on a national level that most people will remember. Unfortunately, everybody seems to have very, very short memories, and we're
they
all too tied up in our own issues
yes.
to worry for more than 5 minutes,
Well, we
because we
get
can
so
just.
easily we get so easily distracted, don't we? By nonsense. But
Indeed,
anyway,
because
yeah.
most people are afraid to face the truth, and that's why we're in the various messes which you've been highlighting brilliantly over the last few months. But let's give you the
Do
national story, the one about Chris Grayling,
yes.
when he was the transport minister, I think he was, and he was. I read this in I think it was in the Guardian. I'm just reading my notes here,
Right.
and he misspent. Get this now, misspent 2.7 billion.
Wow.
Okay, He then became known as Failing Grayling. What a great name that was.
Mm.
And apparently, at the time of the Brexit nonsense, there was this concern that we wouldn't have enough ships bringing goods over the channel.
Oh yes, I
So,
remember. Yeah.
so Mr. Grayling offered a contract to a friend. Apparently, I don't know the name of the friend, and a company called Seabourn Freight was offered the deal. Now, Seabourn Freight didn't have a freight business. They didn't have any ships. They had no people. They had no
I
offices. There
remember this.
was
Yeah, I
simply
remember this.
no knowledge, and there was a contract, as I said, of £14 billion. That's an awful lot of money. Um, and Seabourn Freight, as I said, was offered the deal. Apparently, Eurotunnel wasn't considered as to be able to
Bring goods in.
be involved in this, and seemingly they sued the government for £33 million for damages. So
Who
33
who
million
who
pounds.
sued, who sued the government?
Eurotunnel.
Eurotunnel, because
Yeah,
they weren't offered the.
that's right.
Yeah.
So he offered it to one of his little pals. I think if you look on WikiLeaks, it's all listed in there.
He had
Um,
a fleet of rowing boats, did he? He was just going to row stuff. Because he didn't have
yeah,
any
well,
boats, did he? He didn't have any ships at all.
but the rowing boats have come in very handy for something that's happening currently, so they weren't wasted.
Oh yes, that's true. These little rubber dinghies. I'm sure. I'm
Indeed.
sure somebody somewhere has got a contract to supply those. That very happily, perhaps a backhander going on from various governmental departments, shall we say?
Yeah, sure. Now I've got another little story, which just this is more current now. It was only
Right.
last year. I
Yeah.
had my car repaired, and I had to take it to a specialist because of the particular issue that it was. And the company that did the repair for me, they owned numerous different companies, and I met the MD of the company. He was a really nice guy. My car was going to be in the garage for quite a few hours, and so he showed me around this little industrial estate where his individual companies all traded from. And he had one company that had a small manufacturing unit in it. And it was during the time where, oh, sorry, he was telling me about an incident where his little girl went to school during that situation you talk about where there was a medical intervention.
Oh yes, I
Okay.
remember those days. There was some sort of thing floating about, with airborne
Correct.
thing, and we all wore Mickey Mouse masks,
Indeed.
pretending that
Well,
we were unable to catch it.
sure. So what happened as we're going across the car park, I
Hmm.
noticed this really, really nice car. And I said to him, "Whose is that?" And he went, "Oh, that's mine." He said, "I got that for free."
Oh,
I
nice.
said, "Really? How did you manage that?" He says, "It's a great little story." We were on the same page with regards to the mask wearing and all of that.
Right. Yeah.
So as he's taken me up to his small clothing manufacturing unit, he said, "I'll tell you how I got it for free." He said, "My little girl went to school, and he said we'd knocked up a couple of masks for her. We'd put a print on them so that she would be different to everybody else. So she goes into school wearing these two masks. Teacher notices it. All the kids notice it. All the other children wanted these masks. Teacher asked where she got them from. She said, "My dad makes them in his factory." Okay, he'd only made two just for her.
No, she wasn't
So,
lying. She wasn't lying, was she?
indeed,
He makes
indeed.
these.
So the teacher in question knew that one of the local councillors, who was her friend, had been looking to secure 19,000 masks. It
Right.
was at a time when there was a big shortage,
Yeah.
apparently. So the teacher thinks, "Oh, I'll ring the girl at the council and I'll tell her that we've got this local businessman who makes them,
Hmm.
and I'm sure he'd be delighted to get an order for 19,000." So phone call happens. The next phone call is from the counsellor to the guy in question at his factory, and he says, "Oh, I only made two for my little girl. We haven't got the capacity to make a large quantity. What's the problem?" So she explains, "We're looking for 19,000, and I was hoping you could make them for us." He said, "No, it'd take me a year to make that many. We only do a very small capacity of manufacturing here." He said, "But I may, through a contact, be able to locate some." So he gets on the phone to a pal who's just 50 miles away, and he says to him, "How many do you want?" He says, 19,000. And the guy says, "I've actually got 19,200 in stock of those blue ones." So the chap gets back to the counsellor and he says, "Yeah, I can secure them." And she says, "Marvellous. When could you get them to me?" He says, "Well, I'll go down in my van and pick them up this afternoon, and I'll bring them to you first thing in the morning." Fantastic. So he delivers them. There's no price been agreed.
Right.
Okay.
Gosh.
She sends through an order or a requisition form, which he gets on his desk. He goes and picks them up, delivers them in the morning, and he takes in an invoice. Now, being a very enterprising chap as he was, he didn't tell me the exact amount, but he said, "I paid pennies for them." Okay, because we know that they were manufactured in sweatshops in China for 10 cents or whatever it was.
Yeah.
So he's picked them up. Let's just assume he's paid 20p for
Right.
these things, maybe 10p or whatever they were. So he's given them an invoice with £1 profit on each. So we charge them £1.20
Yeah.
per item. 19,200. He's made himself £19,200. So before he got back to his office, the money had been transferred into his account.
Wow.
He'd actually seen this car on a local forecourt that his pal owned, and he's gone along and he goes, "I've just done a great deal. I'll
I'll
have
have
that
it.
car." He had several
Yeah.
cars apparently. And he'd gone along and bought this car, and that was how he got his free car.
Yeah.
Again, it's non-accountability.
But I mean,
These,
that that you can't blame him. He just the government have asked for these masks. They haven't negotiated a price. He's
right.
just said, "Look, I'll have £1 on each one." I mean, they could have laughed at him and said, "Don't be ridiculous. We'll give you 30p a mask,"
That's right.
and he still would have made a profit to pay for him to go and pick them up in his van and all of that and his time. But how stupid! And presumably the government. I mean, they just transferred the money because they were under such huge pressure to get these things to the various people to be seen to be doing something.
Indeed.
And I suppose there's a sort of the counter argument. To be fair, I don't give the government a lot of leeway in these things, but just to be fair to the government on this particular occasion, they were under a lot of stress because. Well, I say they were under a lot of stress. It seems to me it was a self-inflicted amount
Indeed.
of stress.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah, that they've put forward the argument that there's this killer virus and we all need to wear this stuff, and so then they're panicking to show that they can lead, and clearly they couldn't, and they were just pulling at every string possible. But the real the crime is that they're spending taxpayers' money absolutely stupidly. And that could have been, as we've seen now, people were on the street, people lost businesses, and that's just a sample of how it escalated to the point that here we are in a cost of living crisis, where people are pretty, finding it extremely rough, and that money could still be in the kitty if they hadn't have been so panicky. And the weird thing is, didn't we have the WHO ran a simulation not too long before, so there must have been ministers who knew what they would do if they needed to buy stuff for a virus, things like masks. Where would they get them from? What would be the likelihood of them supplying it to us? If they couldn't get them from where, what other company, what do the government do in between?
Yes, it was called Event 201.
There you are. And then suddenly they're panicking, going, "Oh, we've heard that this little girl in a school's got a mate, or his dad, can supply us with 19,000." Very odd number, really, as well. 20,000 would have been a nice rounded up number.
That's the figure he told me, as I remember.
It's strange, isn't it?
Yeah.
But there we go. Sorry about the slight interference on your. I think that's your end, isn't it? The powers that be.
As we said earlier, I think it's the alien invasion. Perhaps it's just them trying to come through from another dimension.
Yes. So there we go. It's a fascinating world. This goes on and on. I'm sure people in the comments will be mentioning how they've seen it in their line of business, no doubt. I don't know what we can do about it, because I suppose if people see a cushy number, then what are you going to do? You're going to make life as easy as possible for yourself. In a way, you can't I was going to say you can't blame people. I mean, needs must when the devil drives, and if you work for yourself, as people know, some jobs are more cushier than others, and sometimes, sometimes in the past I've had jobs when I was doing extra work, didn't pay very much on television, and you were just a walk-on part, and you'd be hanging around, but you turn up and have a big breakfast, then you'd be hanging about waiting to do your little bit of behind frosted glass at the end of the corridor acting. Very, very, great acting I used to do in the Bill.
Sure.
And then you'd have tea and cake, and you'd still be hanging about, and then eventually you'd do your little bit. And you could have a very nice cushy number. Other times, far more stressful, trying to learn lines, got to do a complicated something or other. And so you can't really blame people for taking it. So who do you blame?
You blame the people who create it, your government leaders. How many civil servants do we have? How many people do we have in the House of Commons, House of Lords? Are they all necessary? No, of course they're not. We can simplify the law, as you've gone into in great detail with numerous guests. Your pal from Geoff Buys Cars came out with a great one a few weeks ago, where he was encouraging people to go online and fill in the forms to protest or to lodge their complaints against the introduction of the ULEZ scheme, etc. And he said, just before he went off on his holiday, and I think he said something along the lines of, when he becomes the president, he will simplify things, etc. And I said, yes, and I'll be your number one minister. You only need one minister. If you just had a minister for common sense, that would essentially solve everything, because that's the one thing that's lacking in all of this.
Absolutely. There's certainly a lot of common sense. But then as you and I probably know, there seems to be ulterior, if I can get the words out, ulterior motives for a number of things that lack a lot of common sense that seems to be coming down the line to us, that governments seem to be acquiescing very oddly, which with an election coming up, you just think, why would you be pushing these things now? You'd think you'd be pushing them at the other side of the election. So it's all very odd. But we better draw this to a close. A fascinating and interesting insight into the corruption, the ineptitude, and sometimes the sheer laziness of people and the ability to just get away with stuff.
Yeah, it'd be great to see somebody set up a channel where, I'm not sure if I said this earlier or whether we spoke about it before we went on air, but it'd be great to see somebody set up a channel where all of this and much, much more, and I'm sure it would be a massive amount of information available out there, where people could come forward and present their information.
Yeah. I think when it's public money, and then we're told we haven't got enough money all the time, and we see the sort of wages that people are getting, or the amount of wasted money that's being sent overseas for reparations, or all these stupid projects, or all the sort of like the ULEZ cameras that are going up, all this sort of money, and then we see how ineptitude people are within the councils and government. That's the thing. I mean, we need a root and branch change, don't we? In how we do all of this. Yeah. And people, and the other thing is that somebody said to me, we need personal accountability again. If people making these decisions just weren't hiding behind the shield of, well, it's government, that actually these decisions that they're making, that actually they had their reputation, and indeed, if they were called up upon it, they were personally responsible, a bit of responsibility, so that we can pull them up. Indeed. I think that would make them a little bit more cautious about taking advantage or just letting things slip and not knowing the price of things before they buy them.
Sure. Yeah, I absolutely agree. How we do that, though, is the $64 million question now, isn't it?
Well, we just need a whole new government system, really. It seems to me this whole system is way overdue for a complete rehaul from the ground up.
Of course.
From the top down, really. It just needs all of it wiping away.
So the more exposure we can give to it, the better.
Yeah, indeed. So that if somebody wants to set up a site in which whistleblowers can go and report on this stuff and call people out, naming and shaming, I think
Perfect.
would be a good thing. Geoff, it's been lovely to talk to you. Thank you for
Thank you.
bringing up the subject. A fascinating insight there. And I'm sure many people have been nodding and going, yeah, I've seen that in my business, but I don't say anything. And maybe some people are sitting there going, yeah, you just described the cushy job that I've got, and they
Yeah,
may
there'll
be a
few
bit
of those.
worried about that. Again, it's not at the people who are at the sharp end any of this is aimed at. It's just sometimes these systems are so bloated, and when it's public money, and there's Mrs. Jones sitting in a one-bed house or flat, and she can't heat herself because the government say they don't have enough money to help her. That's when it becomes obscene and
Absolutely.
insulting.
Yeah, it is.
And that's why these things do matter.
Of course it is.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you so much for talking to me, Geoff. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you for dressing up for the part.
Yes, well, as I said before, I like to try occasionally.
I imagine you're now going to get into your TARDIS and disappear
off.
into
I'll go into
another
one.
galaxy somewhere. Brilliant. Well, there we go, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you've enjoyed today's interview. A little bit different from some of the recent stuff. Interested to see your comments, of course. But from Geoff and I, thank you for watching. I will be back again very soon with another interview. Until then, goodbye.